Welcome back to the Postpartum Plan podcast. This podcast is designed to support and empower you through postpartum. Whether you're expecting, in the early postpartum days, or beyond, this space is for you. I'm your host, Madison Fugere, a dedicated postpartum doula and pediatric sleep consultant, striving to help parents feel confident and supported in their parenting journey. Each week, I'm sharing practical tips and expert advice to help you navigate all the postpartum things with confidence. Well, as much confidence as you can. Let's embark on this journey together, making your parenthood as serene and supportive as possible. Dr. Stephanie Dueger is an author, educator, parent coach, and psychotherapist who works with expectant and new parents and their little ones up to age 5. Her book, Preparing for Parenthood, 55 Essential Conversations for Couples Becoming Family, is the book she wishes she had for herself when she first became a parent, and was the winner of a bronze medal for parenting and relationship books in the 2022 Global Book Awards, and a finalist in the 2023 Book Excellence Awards. She facilitates parent workshops and courses and was the editor-in-chief of the academic journal of Pre- and Perinatal Psychological and Health from 2019 to 2022. Dr. Dueger lives in Boulder, Colorado with her husband, 2 daughters, and furball of a dog. Thank you so much for joining me today, Stephanie. I'm excited to chat because I think that, parenthood and, a couple going through new parenthood can be such a sticky and emotional situation. So I'm excited to talk and bring some light to the conversation and hopefully offer some tips and tricks for parents. So thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Madison. Excited to be here.
Yeah. So I know when we were kind of originally connecting and chatting, there was, so much that we kept talking about in relation to new parents. And so we were like, I think that's the perfect topic. So I think there's probably so much that we can dive into today, but I figure they'll hear your bio before this, but do you want to tell everybody a little bit about, your background, what you do with families, and kind of what your offerings are like, so that if they are listening and they decide they want to tune into you, kind of know where they can find you and all of that before we start?
Sure. Yeah. So I am a psychotherapist, a parent coach, an author, and an educator. And I live in Boulder, Colorado. And so I can only right now work with therapy clients in Colorado, but I can work with parent coaching clients anywhere in the world. And I basically focus on expectant and new parents and their little ones up to about age 5, and just helping them have a smoother transition into becoming pregnant, going through pregnancy together, and adjusting to new and early parenthood. And I find that for couples and individuals who are doing this on their own, it's a bumpy transition for most people. And a lot of people are not expecting it to be. And so I like to just help them have an easier transition, because also for myself and my partner, it was a bumpy transition and we weren't expecting it to be. So I wrote a book called Preparing for Parenthood, 55 Essential Conversations for Couples Becoming Families, that came out in 2020, which was a really fun year for people.
Oh, yeah.
And it was kind of about just trying to help people have an easier transition by having some conversations and delving into some tricky things that I wish that my husband and I had kind of unpacked before we went into parenthood. And some of the things we did, and a lot of them we didn't. And
Right.
made some things a little more challenging than they probably needed to be.
Right. And I love that you have this book, because I literally not expecting a child anytime soon right now, but personally, I'm like, I think I need to buy this book just because, why not? I think it's so awesome that you're able to kind of lay out these conversations that should be had early on or prior to having a little one, because when you're sleep deprived and your hormones are racing and you're experiencing this new like part of life, I guess, in a way that you've never experienced life before, it's probably so hard to be able to still, think rationally in a way, right? So
Exactly.
I love that you have these questions. Would you be willing to kind of share with the listeners maybe a top three or something like that, of things that you see that new parents, once they're experiencing new parenthood, kind of the road bumps, the three top that you see with couples or with people that tend to cause issues?
Sure, absolutely. So, just to preface it, the whole first third of the book is all about, like, before you even, it's just about the couple, right?
I love
And if
that.
you are a person who is having a baby on your own, you can have these conversations with yourself, right?
Yeah.
So it's really intended for people to really strengthen their relationship or their relationship to themselves and get really clear about certain questions prior to becoming parents. Because, like you said, once you're sleep deprived and you are caring for a little human 24/7, things get a lot trickier. And so, the things that I tend to see that people tend to come to me for um, tend to revolve around two main issues. And the first one's communication, the second one is intimacy. Um, and so everything else kind of falls under one of those buckets in general. So there are other big pieces like, we're not sleeping or baby's not sleeping. How do we kind of navigate nursing the baby or bottle feeding the baby, or like we're struggling with that. So those are other pieces, but a lot of that breaks down into communication pieces. And so when I work with couples or individuals having babies, we really try to unpack the piece around communication first, because it's the foundation for everything else, right? If
Right.
you are struggling to communicate, um, everything else becomes more difficult, right? And so sometimes I think in this culture in particular, meaning in North America, United States particularly, um, we can get kind of insular in our thought process, in our way of being in the world. So we're not so much in a village. Most people are not in that kind of environment. And so we tend to each live in our own homes and be doing this parenting thing pretty isolated.
Yeah.
Um, so it can get very stressful very quickly, right? So you
Oh,
have
yes.
this little being who has really high needs, and the only way they know how to tell you is to cry and scream and get dysregulated, which is designed to dysregulate the adults so that we do something, right? And so we have to learn how to communicate well with each other under that kind of stress. So it's not like having a normal conversation with your partner over dinner or something. This is like under stress communication
Right,
for
right.
most people. So it changes kind of the way the decks are stacked, I feel like. And so we have to be able to like really ground ourselves, really stay present, and know that we're on the same team as our partner.
Right.
Or if we're doing this alone, we can find a way we can manage this. And if we can't, we can get support. But people tend to come to me and and everything kind of breaks down under that stress, which makes sense, right? There's nothing unusual about that, but they want to know how to get back on track because they want to preserve their partnership. They want to raise the child together, and they don't want to break up in the process of this. And so, helping people have those really present, grounded conversations is such a practice, right? It's a practice for all of us, even if my kids are preteens and teens, and it's still a practice for my partner and I. So it's really about just like giving people tools. So my experience is if you had these conversations or these kinds of conversations prior to becoming super stressed as parents or super sleep deprived, it can be easier then to remember and say, hey, remember when we talked about this and we decided this, right? Rather than in the moment, hey, I can't go grocery shopping. Can you go pick up some groceries? Well, no, like I'm here, I'm like trying to nurse the baby or doing this, or I haven't slept in, 5 days. And no, I can't function. Right. And then it turns into an argument and then
Right.
things start to. So, biggest one is communication. And then the second biggest one is intimacy. Um, and so, without intimacy in a relationship, you're friends, right?
Right.
Or you're co parents.
Yep.
So, um, and so it's a really big piece to try to renegotiate and bring back after a child is born. So if the couple has, birthed the baby versus adopted or something, it becomes a much bigger issue, right? So the partner who had the baby, their body needs to heal, it needs to um, go through a whole process where it's actually safe and okay to be intimate again. But also, often that person is nursing the baby or has the baby on them all day long. And so the experience can be that they're like super touched out. They're like,
So touched out.
I don't want anyone
I
near
see it all
me.
day long.
Yeah. And the idea of allowing someone else to come in and voluntarily put their hands on you is like no way, like not
Right.
happening. And so it can cause a lot of stress because we hear like, hey, normally around 6 weeks,
Yep.
longer if you've had a cesarean birth, but around 6 weeks is normally when you can resume intimate interactions. But a whole lot of stuff happens in a birth, right? And it may still feel uncomfortable or
Right.
painful, even, and usually the birthing person's libido, it has fully tanked. Like there's
Yeah.
nothing in the tank there. But the person who didn't birth the baby is like, okay, like I'm waiting, I'm holding on.
Right.
It's
It's
six
like a
weeks, like
countdown.
the alarm goes off and it's like, yay, let's do this. And so there can be some hurt feelings, right? And so again, going back to communication as the cornerstone here of like, um, how do we talk about this thing that, a lot of people in our culture maybe don't even talk about at all,
Right.
right? Let alone when there's a baby in the picture. Right. So like it's either like, yeah, it kind of happens and it's maybe we're embarrassed to talk about sex or things like that, right? Versus this is going to be an important thing that comes up. And
Yeah.
how are we going to navigate the different potential things that could happen? And in the moment, it can feel really different than what you talked about prior. So there's that as well. So it's really trying to find your way back to each other and finding ways to be intimate and connected when maybe you can't have sex,
Yeah.
right? Or you don't want to have sex. Like it's usually one person who doesn't want to have sex.
Right.
So just to like kind of keep that in mind. So those are really big pieces. And then kind of off of those kind of major branches and the littler branches of roles, right? So often when we have a baby and we're in partnership, our roles shift pretty dramatically, especially in the
Mm-hmm.
first couple months. And so all the things that your partner was doing that maybe were completely, not, they weren't explicit, right? It's like, yeah, like I always take the trash out and that's just what I do. And
Yeah.
um, I always take care of the bills and that's just what I do. And maybe you don't even talk about it. It's
Right.
just you fall into these roles. A baby comes along and usually it's like a little bomb goes off in the house, right? And suddenly things aren't getting done. The balls are getting dropped. And partners often don't know, like they have it in their mind, like, hey, like I thought Like you always go grocery shopping. Like there's no food in the fridge, or you always make dinner, or you always take the trash out, or whatever it is. You always walk the dog. Um, and and there can be such a huge role shift that it's challenging to figure out how to find your way back to keeping a household running, whatever that looks like for your individual experience. And there can be a lot of awkward, uncomfortable arguments about that.
Oh, yes.
I always give the example, and I have to preface this by saying my husband's a therapist like I am, and he's excellent and he's super attuned. And we've grown a long way since our first baby. But I want to preface this by saying he's amazing. And I will not forget, like, after he went back to work, which was probably, I don't know, a week or two after our first daughter was born, he came home and I was having one of those 24-hour periods where I hadn't slept, baby was crying, I had certainly hadn't showered, the house was a mess. He came in after a full day of work. He's exhausted. You know, the house is kind of dark. There's like laundry piled up, and he's like, "What did you do all day?" You know, and I can't tell you how often the partner who's going out and working at that time comes back and says something
It's
similar
that.
to that, like,
Right.
"Hey, like, where's the food?" Um,
Right.
you know, and for me, I was like, "What do you mean? Like, I've been nursing the baby, I'm trying to sleep, I'm like, you like just getting, I'm surviving here is
Yeah.
what I'm doing." And so just that we hadn't spoken about that and we needed to adjust our roles. And
Hmm.
I was not very skillful in my response at that time. And I'm pretty sure I bit his head off. And he was like, "Whoa, okay." And then, but it was great because he was like, "Okay, I think I missed what's happening here. Like,
Right.
fill me in. What are you doing all day?"
Yeah.
And I could have empathy for his point of view of like, "Hey, like I know you just went out and worked all day and did this really hard work and you came home and there's no food and you know I'm still in bed and all this stuff."
Right.
So we found common ground, but I think helping people normalize that, you
Yeah.
know, prior to it happening, like you should expect some similar situation,
Yep.
and for roles to really need to change and to be explicit about it.
Yeah, I had created I'll have to show it to you because I don't know if you've seen actually all the pages of it, but I have a postpartum plan like workbook that
Mhm.
people can download on the show notes below, but I'll send it over. You can take a peek at it if you want to. But it is a great option because it makes you think about things like that. I mean, I don't have a page specifically on, whose roles are what, because I feel like you say these things, but then as things actually happen and in real time, things change. But it gives you a chance to think about stuff. And there's a whole sheet of resources where like you kind of fill in names and numbers and stuff. And part of that being like, okay, do you have someone to walk the dog? Do you have someone to come take care of the older siblings? And like that kind of in a similar way opens that conversation and communication to be like, okay, who's able to do what? What are we thinking we might be able to do, even if it doesn't become a reality? At least you're thinking that way. And then you can easily be like, I know I said I would cook dinner, but I'm really having a hard time. And then when you need to communicate things to your partner. I think that's so important.
Yeah, and that what a great resource for people, right? Like just to be having those conversations, making some kind of at least tentative plan
Exactly.
and having like names and numbers, like, "Hey, things are not going well in this area. How do we get support?" And rather than
Right.
in the moment under an immense amount of stress, being like, "How do we find a lactation consultant, for example, or a sleep consultant or whoever?" Um, and being in that panic space, you already have at least numbers to start with, right? Like,
Yes.
okay, like this person does this. We can call them, we can get some help.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Or I need to take a nap. Like, here's a list of, people who said they want to help, and I trust this person to watch my kid while I sleep. Or, all these things that can be so beneficial to the communication side of things.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So critical.
Yeah. Now, that's like one way to kind of handle the, one big stressor of the communication, right? Like preparing ahead of time. Now, say people are listening and they are freshly postpartum, right? And they weren't able to kind of start those conversations early on. What's a good way that you can suggest that they either approach their partner to like set up this conversation and find a way to have this open dialogue, or yeah, like how do you suggest that they go about, turning it around if they need to?
Yeah, great question. So keeping in mind that freshly postpartum, you get little tiny snippets,
Yep.
right? So planning out like a big time to have conversation or a group of conversations can be challenging.
Right.
So what I would recommend is to just lob it out like a softball to your partner, like, hey, I'm wondering if maybe we could talk about some stuff. Like I'm just noticing things are really different since we've had our baby, and I want to make sure that we're, doing everything that we can to support each other and support our baby and create a nice nest here for all of us. And then just maybe pose one question like, hey, like I notice Barney the dog isn't isn't getting out as much as he needs to. And maybe we could find somebody who could walk him once a day. And then, you could walk him twice a day or someone else. Right. And so it's just like throwing out a potential and having the conversation without going into like blaming or accusing or anything like that, right? So it's not like, hey, you're never walking the dog anymore. What's, like the dog's barking all the time and the baby's trying to sleep. And, rather than kind of going that route, it's like, hey, let's try to be solution focused here to the best that we can do right now. And we'll try it out and we'll see what happens.
Right.
And then
Get a
we need to
trial
build a
period.
lot of, yeah, we need a lot of flexibility in our plans because things are constantly shifting with a baby and within partnership with a baby. Um, and so just being like knowing that that's the norm, knowing that fresh postpartum, like sometimes it's hard to tell when it's day and when it's
Total
night.
days.
I mean, at
Total
this
days.
point, right? And sometimes people are like really blissed out in that period, which is also like lovely. Like you don't want to interrupt that lovely bonding and attachment time. And so it's finding little times to just, hey, can we just quickly talk about like how I can't eat onions right now? Like something small, just like
Yeah.
get the ball rolling, without making it like we have to sit down and
Right.
unpack everything, which I'm probably not even going to remember tomorrow because I haven't
Right.
slept and who knows how long. So it's
Yeah,
just really
sometimes
small
the
pieces.
yeah, the short informal conversation, although that may not be the way that you typically communicate, may be the best way to do so when you only have those small bits of time for sure. That makes total sense. And I love the
Yeah.
idea of bringing up, something little that isn't accusatory maybe first to kind of get the ball rolling is a great idea. I love that. And then you mentioned the second thing being, intimacy and sex being something that it can be really difficult for families. And I mean, I hear this constantly. I'm when I'm working with my postpartum clients, always, especially if it's first kiddo, giving them the heads up that their 6 week appointment is typically when they're talking about birth control and intimacy, and to kind of mentally prepare for that because sometimes they don't know that this is coming in a way. And then mentally preparing and deciding if, even though the doctor says, yeah, you're good to go, like, are you ready? Do you want to? Right. I would love to know like tips and tricks that you give people on, if they're the partner that is wanting to initiate and their partner doesn't, how do they, have enough grace for their partner and patience for their partner, yet, still not letting, their needs and wants be trampled. And then vice versa, right?
Right. Yeah. Great question. So yeah, it can be a really tricky period of time. And hopefully the couple has a strong enough relational foundation that they can have some of these harder conversations of like, hey, it's not that I don't love you. It's not that I'm not attracted to you. I just have nothing in the tank here. Right. And yet the partner's like, I've been waiting for 6 weeks. Like, I've been so good, like
Right.
waiting and so excited to, get back together with you. And I feel shut down. So often that's kind of the course it
Yeah.
takes, and there's resentment. Right. And so I like to invite people to find ways to be intimate with each other without sex. So, or without intercourse necessarily. So, what can you do like to feel close to your partner, to let your partner know, hey, I care about you. It's not a rejection of you. Um, and let's make a plan for checking in another week, right? So have a plan like maybe we can just wait till 7 weeks and then try, right? So like if it feels like it's in your wheelhouse at all, to even just like broach it a little bit, even if you're like, I like, I'm not really interested. Because sometimes once we get over that hump a little bit, it's like, well, I guess it's okay. Like,
Right.
I like the closeness. I'm, not super excited about the intercourse or whatever, but I like the closeness, right? And so finding ways to be intimate first that don't involve intercourse.
Hmm.
And there are so many different ways to do that, right? Um, and then making a time period to check back in, like, hey, let's check in next week or in 2 weeks and just see where you're at um, and potentially try to make this move forward a little bit because sex is so important for couples, right?
Right.
And so it's a really important way to stay connected. And the farther and farther you get away from that, um, sometimes the harder it is. And obviously, there are lots of people who are in relationships who never have sex for various reasons. And so it's not impossible, right? But if it's a part of your normal relationship, and pre-baby, then trying to bring it back, I think, is helpful in terms
Yeah.
of uplifting the relationship and feeling more connected.
Right. And I think it's so important to mention and note. I know when we first talking, we were mentioning it about how the first year post baby is, you said the highest for divorce rate is the first year, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And so between that and then, like you said, if these are all these normal things in your relationship typically, and now you're not having them, it can feel like a bit of a rejection, right? And so I think remembering that you're not alone with it too, right? Like people are probably listening to this and are probably like reassured knowing that they're not the only ones, that it does get better. And to remember that, you do get over the hump. It may take a bit of work and a bit of time. Um, but yeah, like the fact that the highest divorce rate in the first year, I mean, it makes total sense. But when you're in it, I'm sure it's hard to remember, that you're not by yourself.
exactly. And I think too, just to piggyback on that, if we bring in like the masculine and feminine, and by that I don't necessarily mean male and female. I mean, we each have masculine and feminine in all of us. But the person who generally one person in the relationship will have a heavier feminine role and one will have a heavier masculine role in general. Sometimes they're equally balanced, but I think, it's really rare that I've seen that. So the person is holding more of the feminine role, meaning in relationship only, which is not like how you act at work or anything like that. It's just in your intimate relationship. Generally, that person, it's more important for them to have a deep emotional connection to feel like they want to be intimate,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, um, whereas sometimes the person holding more of the masculine energy, that's not quite as important. They like need more of the physical
Right.
connection before they can get to the emotional. But to kind of plant for the more masculine person, if you want to try to encourage your partner who maybe is like, nah, I'm not interested. I have no libido. There's no interest. Um, Connecting emotionally first is generally the key, right? So like once there's that emotional connection, the person usually tends to be a little more open.
Yeah.
Like, well, okay, like I do love you. It's not just like, hey, I have these needs and I need to get them met now,
Right. Right.
right? Like it's kind of a push, a masculine push. And so it's an invitation sometimes to couples to
Yeah.
like, whichever one of you plays more of the masculine or the feminine, like take this into consideration. Like try to connect, try to find each other emotionally first, especially if one person just birthed a baby,
Right.
right? Like it's a big deal. So
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's so important, like you said, bringing that like communication, right? So even if it is asking your partner and like trying to urge them to talk about something that isn't just the baby, right? Because it's so easy to get into baby brain and in turn only be talking about like, oh, did they poop today? How many wet diapers did they have? How did they nurse today? Their latch is shallow, their latch is not, right?
right.
Being able to be like, how are you feeling? Or, how are you feeling about being a new parent? Or even being like, oh, you really loved knitting. Have you gotten to knit at all? Or like little things like that, that may be more of like your pre-baby typical conversation. It's hard to have. So I found that helps a lot with my clients when I urge them to still have like intimate quote unquote conversations. Like being able to start it with things like that, are pretty neutral, but make the conversation enthusing and different than it has been all day long.
Yeah, and it's such a great point. It's like really it's such a transition for someone to move from this stage of not having a child to having, especially their first child. Um, it's such a huge, we talked a little bit about roles in terms
Hmm.
of what you do at home, but roles in terms of who you are as a human being. Like, um, say it's a woman has a baby and she moves from being this kind of maiden archetype into being a mother archetype. Like it's a huge rite of passage, whether you identify as a woman or not a woman. It's still a huge transition as you move through that rite of passage. So you're moving from one way of knowing yourself to be in the world into this very different way where you are 100% responsible for this little human.
Hmm.
And it changes your brain. I mean, literally changes your brain um,
Yeah.
for both parents, but especially for the person who birthed the child. It's like hormonally and everything else, like your brain completely shifts. And so getting to know yourself again and inviting conversations, like the partner, especially inviting conversations like, hey, like, this is huge. Like, you just walked through this portal into this new universe. Like, how are you? How are you
Yeah.
doing? And then that partner checking back, like, this is huge for you. Like, how is it for you being a parent?
Right.
And how are you feeling in this system when maybe the birth parent is nursing the baby all the time and there's like this little love nest going on and the partner might feel a little left out,
Right.
right? Like, well, it's hard. Like I used to be that I used to be your number one and now
Right.
baby's taken that place,
Hmm.
right? So there are all these tremendous shifts, and it really, like, I do describe it as a rite of passage because it's a huge change in terms of who you are and how you know yourself to be on the planet.
Yeah. Oh, I love all of that. It's so true. And I think that we could have this conversation for hours and hours and hours, but I think that those two big, communication and intimacy and sex, are just like definitely the two things that I see the most. So I'm glad that that's, the two that you mentioned as well. Now I like to wrap up. Is there like a specific product or, thing? It can be a service or an item that you typically suggest to your clients. And then also, do you have a bit of advice? Like if you had one piece of advice to kind of share with new parents, new families, what kind of stuff would you share?
Sure. So I'd like to invite parents who are able to consider getting like a postpartum doula or something after having a baby. I think it's really helpful, especially in those early weeks, to get as much hands-on support as you can.
Yeah.
And then, just not being afraid to reach out for any support you need, whether it's psychological or just emotional or, you know, practical help, really reaching out for that. Um, and then, yeah, so that's both advice and service.
Totally
And
fine.
yeah, and then I am looking, if anybody's interested, I am looking for new
Yes.
parents, specifically new birth parents who have birthed babies and just wanting to create an experience for them where we do some coaching and just, check in on a weekly basis and help them transition, like make that transition from an individual to a parent or a couple to a parent, and what that means in terms of who they are now and what their body has been through and what they're going through emotionally, physically, all of the things that can crop up. And so, if anyone out there is listening and interested, please feel free to contact me and I can share a little bit more about what I'm thinking about that.
Yeah, I was definitely going to mention that too. Check out the notes below if you are somebody who has birthed a baby and are interested in some coaching support from the lovely Stephanie. And yeah, all of her info will be below. Thank you so much for joining me today and for tackling this conversation that I think so many are going to appreciate. So I'm sure we will have you back for more anytime. You're more than welcome.
Thank you so much, Madison. It was great talking to you.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Postpartum Plan podcast. I hope that today's episode brought you support, relatability, and valuable insight. Remember, you're not alone on this journey. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave a review and share with any of your prenatal and postpartum friends and family. Your feedback helps us reach more parents seeking support. And if you're looking for additional resources, please feel free to connect via Instagram at Serene Moments Doula for constant information, tips, and tricks, or check out my website, www.serenemomentsdoula.com. See you next week.